Welcome, fellow baked goods. I'm Mr. McScruffmuffin. Professor Oak says it's too dangerous to go into the tall grass, and today I'm thinking about sins. Alright, so that's a fun topic, right? Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about this from a Catholic perspective, so I'm going to be using Catholic theological terms. I'll try to define all of them as I go. But first thing that I'd like to clear up about the 7 deadly sins is that in Catholic theology, deadly sins are not necessarily mortal sins and vice versa. So there'll be more on mortal sins in a later video. So the deadly sins can be mortal sins, but they're not necessarily. I just wanted to clear that up right off the bat. So what makes a sin a deadly sin, then? Alright, so it's a deadly sin because it's an insidious thing that corrupts and twists a part of human nature. So it can be difficult to detect in our lives. And the deadly sins are called as such because they lead to other sins. What Thomas Aquinas, who is a saint that you probably know quite well if you've watched a lot of my videos, calls daughters of particular vices. Alright, so that's another name for the 7 deadly sins, the 7 capital vices. So that's a term that might be a little bit more accurate, but sounds way less dramatic. I'll probably use those terms interchangeably. Alright, so the 7 deadly sins, what are they? I remember them with the mnemonic pale gas. That might be an easy way to do it. P-A-L-E-G-A-S. Pale gas stands for pride, anger, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice, and sloth. Alright, so the 7 deadly sins some are more common in particular situations, like in genders or in particular age ranges. It's often said that we're more tempted by lust early in life, pride during middle age, and avarice as we grow older. But all of them find a way to worm their way into our lives at some point. So what have we got here? Alright, here's the thing. I don't want this video to be like 45 minutes to an hour long, so what I'm going to do here is give a quick breakdown of each one and then do a separate video going a little bit more in-depth into each particular topic. So that should keep things to being under 10 minutes long. I think that's probably a good range, and I think that's probably good for you. So sound good? Wonderful, let's proceed. Alright, so pride. Pride is said to be the root of all sin, and it's a doozy of a vice. Pride is an inordinate love of self. So what we're talking about here is not the pride that a parent feels as they hang their kids' artwork on the refrigerator. What we're talking about is a subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, preference for our own importance over others. We're talking about fussiness and making sure that we get our way. We're talking about preferring the esteem in the eyes of our comrades or compatriots over a strong character that's rooted in truth. Pride is the overestimation of ourselves, or possibly the underestimation of others. Its contrary virtue is humility. Now there's a lot there, and like I said, we'll cover each individual vice in its own video. So let's move on to anger. Now we need to be clear here that not all anger is vice. We should be angry over the murder of innocent people or other horrible moral atrocities that we might see in the news. It's a deficiency as a human being if you see something that's horrible and it doesn't in some way make you angry. But what we're talking about here is anger that clouds judgment and leads to destruction of relationships. That's left of moral center. When we're angry in such a way that we're clouded to the truth behind a haze of our own notions, our own bad feelings, and our own ill will, then it's clear that we've crossed a boundary. Now, where exactly the boundary lies is a matter of some careful discernment. That's a little bit tougher to talk about. But what is clear is anger's contrary virtue, namely that of patience. Alright, so lust is the next one. That's the one that everybody either loves or hates to talk about. Now, lust is an inordinate desire or longing for the pleasures of the flesh. The pull of the vice brings us to reduce persons to objects for use, to gratify our own desires, and to view particular faculties in a way that divorces them from the uniting and procreative powers of said faculties for strictly hedonistic ends. Alright, there was a lot of terminology there. I'm being a little bit scientific here to protect the ears of younger muffins who might be listening, but we'll go into that more during the video devoted to lust. Now, the Church has a very rich and very detailed teaching on the matters of the heart and of the relationships between man and woman. So please stay tuned. I think you'll find that it's probably not what you've heard before, and it's very good news. Alright, so the contrary virtue to lust is chastity, which is not some new designer belt. It's a virtue that's full of vigor, of meaning, of splendor, and of vibrancy. Then we've got envy. Envy is not simply a feeling that you feel like when somebody else has something that's nice or that you want or something like that. Envy as a deadly sin is unhappiness or resentment at another person's good. So unhappiness or resentment at another person's good. Now, envy is something that often skims below the surface, and it can be laced with very, very complex emotions. So it's always a good thing to keep a sharp eye on. Now we'll talk about that one in a little bit greater depth, but its contrary virtue is gratitude or kindness. And then we have gluttony. Gluttony is an inordinate desire for food or drink. Now obviously food and drink are good, and, according to the most recent scientific studies, thought to be generally necessary for survival, but the unnecessary consumption of food and drink leads to obesity, hypertension, drunkenness, fussiness on the purely physical plane, and a whole host of spiritual maladies as well. So the contrary virtue of that one is temperance, which is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, if you remember those. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. Then we have avarice. Avarice more commonly translates to greed in modern parlance. It's an inordinate desire for things of this world, for material possessions. It typically takes the form of working ourselves to death to have the most money, or being a little bit fussy so that we can have the fastest car, the most toys, the newest gadget, whatever your fancy might be. Its counter virtue is charity, or sometimes rendered as generosity. And finally we have sloth. Not only a cute furry animal, and also not only laziness, as it's often rendered in today's lexicon, but it also implies a certain tepidness in spiritual things. So it's not only a lack of physical vigor, but also a feeling lowly that one will never be holy or spiritual, or that one isn't capable of putting forth the effort required for great spiritual things, or anything like that. So the counter virtue there is diligence. Diligence. So here we have the 7 deadly sins. 7 capital vices, which we all contend with on a daily basis. But there is hope to combat them. I'll cover each one in a little bit more detail in its own video, but for the time being, knowing and identifying each one of them is critical for removing them from our lives. Live the lively virtues, not the deadly sins. For now, have a great day. Be awesome. Thanks for listening.